Hello everyone, my name is Molly, and throughout this quarter I researched syntax with second language learning. In this PowerPoint, we will talk about my hypothesis of syntax in the L2. I will tell you about my case study student, who is called Melissa, and we will go over her English and what her syntax looks like. I will then talk about my research that I did and what I learned, and then we will see if any of it can be connected to Melissa's English and her syntax. And finally, I will conclude my findings and explain if my hypothesis was supported or not supported. So, as previously stated, I researched syntax in the L2. Specifically, I was asking if the syntax transfers from L1 to the L2, and I hypothesized that there is a direct transfer on the L1 into the L2, but there are levels at which students make these transfers. So to elaborate on that, students learning a second language will make more mistakes of word order due to their lack of knowledge in the L2, and the word order will reflect that of their native language. Then, as students progress in their studies, they will begin to make fewer and fewer syntactical errors, but there will still be an underlying transfer from the L1 into the L2. My case study student, Melissa, was born and raised in Germany. It wasn't until our second meeting that she shared with me that she's actually Turkish. Both of her parents were born in Turkey and both migrated with their families at young ages. Her dad went to Germany at age 3 and her mother went at age 15. So her first language is actually Turkish as opposed to German, which is what I originally thought. Melissa is now 27 and she has been in America for a little over 2 months. She began learning English in the 3rd grade, but she explained that was all very informal and just the basics, such as numbers and greetings. It wasn't until the 4th grade that they began actual lessons in English. Her elementary school experience was difficult, as she told me, because going into her first year, she didn't speak any German at the time. She only spoke Turkish in the home and with her family, so she started school and she couldn't speak the language. She joked that when they started learning English, she was not yet confident in her German, so how was she expected to learn a 3rd language when she couldn't even speak the 2nd one very well? Her goals for coming to America were to speak more natural English and to be able to perform at a higher academic level with her English. I will start this portion of my presentation by adding a disclaimer. Since Melissa's first language was not German, I may fail in recognizing German transfer versus Turkish transfer. I don't know much of the Turkish language, but I will assume the transfers will come from German because Melissa had instructional lessons in German compared to Turkish, which was acquired by being around her family as a young child. Now to move on. Since Melissa started learning English in grade school, she has a good grasp of the language. She is able to understand almost everything I say, including when I speak very fast and not very clear. Her syntax is not something that is largely disruptive to what she is saying. It is noticeable that she's not a native English speaker, so her pronunciation and word order, those do stand out. For the most part, she may mess up 1 or 2 words in a sentence by putting them in a position that English speakers wouldn't put them in, or just forgetting a word like a preposition. For example, she has said, "Do you have always a class on Tuesday?" Since I speak German and I have knowledge of the syntax in that language, I know that temporal information, so time information, will be the first phrase after the verb rather than in English, where it is mainly placed in the last part of the sentence. But if you were to directly translate the sentence into German, it would still be incorrect because all of the temporal information should be together. So in this example, she has created this inner language sentence that is not correct in either language. One thing Melissa does well is her subject-verb-object-word order, but this is also the order in German, so that works in her favor. I had her practice word order with some online websites where it gave all the words in a sentence, but they were all out of order, so she had to put the sentences back together in their correct order. As you can see, I gave her 30 sentences, and from all of them, she only made 2 mistakes. There were many sentences that took her some time to complete, and she would sometimes finish a sentence and then a few minutes later go back and correct the sentence into another order that she believed was correct. So in the first example where she made the mistake I see it as an innocent mistake with articles. If the sentence were referring to a specific salmon that she, whoever she is, can't eat because she is a vegetarian, that would mix up that would be a mix-up between articles of a versus the. In vernacular speech, you often hear people say, "Oh, I'm vegan now." So you can see that Melissa would assume that people also say, "Oh, I'm vegetarian now." But we do put an article with vegetarian, so the sentence is wrong. The other incorrect sentence was, "Are you going leave a big tip?" Here she forgot to add the word to. Overall, Melissa's written syntax is solid and she does not make big errors. As with any language learner, speaking is possibly the most difficult, and this is where Melissa makes most of her mistakes. She has said, "Do you have this also?" Or maybe she was first a man. Again, both of those. Well, not both, but the second one's struggling with temporal location of words. These are the 4 articles that I read to go along with my research, and I will go over each one and discuss what I learned from them. Mark Patkowski tested the sensitive period in L2 syntax acquisition, and his reference of research was Lenneberg's hypothesis that after age 14, an L2 learner will not be able to obtain native-like proficiency. Patkowski's research was conducted by bringing in non-native English speakers and collecting data on how grammatically correct their English is, or was. He found people who had migrated to the U.S. at various ages and who lived in the U.S. for at least 5 years. His results showed that there was a slight correlation between age at which the people came to the U.S. and how good their English was. It was thought that the younger you were, the better your English would be. But there were also outliers that had come to America at an older age and had very good English. A discussion that came up was questioning what native-like English even was, and who can make that distinction, and how would it be made? When does advanced simply become native-like? Those ideas were questioned, and another example of an outlier was called the Conrad phenomenon. So Joseph Conrad was a Polish-born English author who was praised by his works, but his spoken English was apparently not that good. He shows that you can understand the written language and write English syntax at an advanced level, but still struggle with actually speaking English. However, Patkowski concluded that around the age of puberty is the determined time that a person will sound native-like or not. Ludmila Isurin studied the transfer of languages and the loss of the L1. While her study mostly focused on seeing if the subjects have forgotten any of their native languages, word, order, or vocabulary, she does make points about L2 syntax acquisition. She states that the L1 can either help or hinder the progress of the L2. She claims that simple, short sentences are not influenced by the L1 in English, and they may not be a good example for if a L2 learner understands the English syntax. In her conclusion, she states that other languages can affect second language learning. Nienke Mulman talks about her mixed results in the ability to acquire native-like language of an L2. The results show examples of some German and Polish speakers that can become almost fluent-like in their Dutch as an L2, but for other German and English learners, they are unable to reach this almost fluent-like stage in Dutch. Mulman talks about articles in languages, and that by having articles in the native language, if then the L2 has articles, the learner may be at an advantage. The same goes with gendered nouns. The learners might have an advantage of advanced speech in the L2 if the L1 has gender. But there is also evidence that shows that gender is not needed to show full acquisition in the L2. The overall conclusion of this article was that there was no definitive answer on gender or articles in the L1 being a benefit to the learner in the L2, and there may be an interference from the L1 when learning L2 syntax. Malcolm Finney researched how universal grammar is related to learning syntax in a second language. The general theory of universal grammar, UG, implies that any person can learn any language because we have this innate ability to learn language. Finney applied UG to second language learning and brings up the idea that UG falls short when learning a second language. He proposed that there are parameters in UG in different languages and that not every language is able to access UG for the second language. In his research, he studied how his subjects violated syntax rules. What he concluded was the idea that these parameters that he spoke of earlier have to do with the length of time spent in the language community, linguistic backgrounds, and amount of use. And these were all factors that help develop the L2. The sensitive period from Patkowski states that puberty is the time to determine native-like fluency, and this relates to Melissa because she is now 27 years old and much past the pubescent age. She does not get enough English spoken time in Germany, so it is likely that she won't greatly improve beyond where she is now. When she started learning English, she had time to become native-like, but because her instruction was only in school, that was her only time with the English language, she was not able to reach that native-like point in her teens. Patkowski's subjects, they lived in America, so the younger ones who began learning English earlier had the opportunity to interact with the language that Melissa never had. With Isurin's study, she claimed that the L1 can indeed inhibit the growth of the L2. We can see that Melissa at times will mix up her word order. She says things like, maybe she was first a man, which again shows that temporal phrase before the indirect object. Melissa has said the following order a few times: have you a sister? When directly translated into German, the order is correct, hast du eine Schwester? But Melissa has omitted the du, which is an important piece in American English, so do you have a sister? Her English at times reflects German word order, which would support Isurin's claims. With Mollman's study, Mollman wrote briefly of the advantages and disadvantages of having gendered nouns and or articles in the L1. With this case, Melissa is at an advantage because German also has articles, and the number of articles between German and English drops from 3 to 1. With gender, it may be a bit more difficult to explicitly state if the genders create issues with the L2. Fortunately for Melissa, she doesn't make mistakes when it comes to nouns in English. Overall, Melissa did not show any troubles with nouns or articles. Finney's study referred to universal grammar and that there are many factors that influence L2 acquisition. Some factors are length of time in the language community, and another is amount of usage of the language. Melissa does not spend much time in an English-speaking community when she is in Germany, and she does not use English outside of the classroom. This will hurt her English acquisition because she is simply not around the language enough. This supports Finney because it shows that without these outside factors of language learning, having a native-like syntax and language overall is not possible. In the beginning, I hypothesized that L1 syntax directly influences L2 syntax, and that there are levels at which learners will make syntactical errors. Based on my research, I found that my hypothesis was partially supported. It is clear that syntax in the L1 has the opportunity to impact the L2, but I do not think that it directly affects the L2. I also conclude that adults will not reach a native-like fluency in the L2, but that does not mean that an adult can't reach an advanced level of the L2. I thought that there would be distinct levels that learners would perform at, meaning that once a student is an advanced English speaker, they will never make syntactical errors. This was disproved because there is no way to clearly section off mistakes of English syntax. If we look at Melissa, she has been learning English for close to 17 years now, and you would think that she would know that if you ask someone, that she should know that if you ask if someone has something, you ask, do you have this? Not, have you this? And so it is clear that even with learners who are able to communicate with no barriers and who have studied the language for many years, they may still make small syntactical errors. There are a few variables I would change in this research, such as having more planned out lessons and collecting more data from her speech. I took too long in finding a research topic that would fit with Melissa's language placement, and I didn't start writing out her sentences and what she was saying until a few weeks later than I should have. That created a struggle because I could not compare where she started with her syntax to where she is now. I would have been more structured in our meetings, and had I planned out our meetings weeks in advance, that would have helped me create a path of how I wanted to study her syntax. Another factor was that she really wanted to work on improving her grammar, so there were many weeks where we focused solely on that, and I was so focused on helping her that I forgot to collect data of my own. This is my citations page, and with that, this will conclude my presentation. Thank you for listening.